you go. Thank you all for coming, and I want to thank Mark and Stacy, whoever else organized this event and put it all together. I'm very flattered by it. I do want to give one shout out, since Mark mentioned Free Press. The co-founder of Free Press and the executive director is in the back row, Josh Silver. Josh, why don't you stand up for a sec, just say hi. Hi. All right, and Josh is here. We've been working today and tomorrow morning, and I only found out about this trip a couple weeks ago, so this is a real spur-of-the-moment talk. And I know a number of you have been assigned my new book. How many of you were read it, whether you were assigned it or not? How many of you read it, just so I have a sense? Okay, about a third of you, okay. That'll shape how much detail I go into in the talk. For those, Mark very graciously pointed out some of the books I've written. I would say that if you were to look at how the earlier works compare to this new book, starting in 1997, when I wrote a book with Ed Herman called The Global Media, through the next few books, a lot of my work was very standard political economic analysis of how our media system works and what the nature of the media content it generates has been and is, particularly with a look at journalism and the state of journalism in the United States today. Quite critical of journalism. I think the last book I wrote, which I wrote with my friend John Nichols, called Tragedy and Farce, was a detailed look at the nature of press coverage of the 2004 presidential election and the invasion and occupation of Iraq as of 2005. And I think as my work has evolved, and it really culminated in Communication Revolution, is looking much more at the political efforts to change the media system so we won't keep producing this sort of content. So we'll have a vastly superior content, which will require a vastly superior media system. And that's really what this book was all about. My earlier work had an implicit message to communication scholars and students that they ought to be interested in this, they ought to pay attention to it. This book has sort of an explicit message to them. In fact, we're among friends, aren't we, Mark? Before the book was hosed down and copy edited, one friend who read the book said it ought to be titled, "Hey Professor, pull your head out of your ass." But if one were to read it now, it would not, you might not, let's turn that thing off. I could be in hot water for that one. I'm just kidding. Anyway, all the parts that would have produced that title were edited out. Wouldn't you say so? I was very gentle.
Yeah, I was disappointed.
Yeah, I knew you would be. I should have saved that version for you. It's sort of like Jefferson's Bible. So this book is different because what I try to do in it is a number of things. First of all, and one of the large parts of it, because I try to chronicle the extraordinary growth of the media reform movement in the last 5 years, which never ceases to amaze me how few people outside, I mean, there's a lot of people who know about it. Millions of people sign petitions. Lots of people know about free press. People have heard about the fight for network neutrality. They've heard about the fight to stop the Bush administration and corporations from producing fake news that gets carried on television. But still, an astonishing number of Americans don't know about it at all. And it never ceases to amaze me. So I wanted to chronicle these developments. I think just the record of the last 5 years alone is something everyone should pause to consider, because it's really historically unprecedented in American history, maybe even in world history, what we're seeing in the last 5 years in this country. And I think it's a very interesting phenomenon that merits attention. So I wanted to write the first draft while it was fresh in my mind as a participant in it as well. And I wanted also to explain why this has taken place. What is it that would account for this now? Why not 20 years ago, 100 years ago? Why now? What's going on that would explain this huge growth in media policy activism? And then finally, the other goal of the book goes back to communication professors and academics and scholars and researchers in general. I wanted to make the argument in the book, which I do, that there's really a very important role for communication professors, researchers, scholars, students to play in this broader movement. One that's not only in the interest of society that they play, but very much in the interest of those who believe in media studies and communication, because it would be an opportunity for this field to sort of leapfrog its sort of second-tier status and make itself really the most dynamic social science on the university campus. And my sense was, and I'll talk about this briefly later, that communication as a field in the United States today is struggling. It has really not grasped this moment in the way it should have, in the way it needs to, if it wants to be anything more than a largely irrelevant discipline on our campuses. Now, the book makes a number of arguments. I'll run through a few of them. And then these are arguments I've made in other work, but I think I've sort of developed them a little bit more. But they're worth repeating, because I think when you get a few of these points together, it becomes a much more interesting argument than if you take them separately. First of all, we have a profit-driven media system, but it's not a free market system. This is the starting point to understand our media system. Profit-driven, yes, but not free market. The media system in the United States, well, let me preface it this way. All businesses take advantage of public spending. I mean, if you have a business, you take advantage of roads, of public education, of the water system. Government spending benefits all commercial enterprises to some extent, to varying degrees. And media industries are no different that way. But media industries also are the recipients of enormous direct and indirect subsidies and monopoly licenses, right through, including today, as large as ever today, even in the internet, especially in the internet era. And the recognition of this fact is really the starting point for understanding the media reform movement. It's not the only starting point, but it's one of the crucial ones. And we've had these subsidies. Today they assume the form of monopoly licenses for radio and TV channels, for cable systems, for phone systems. They assume the form of copyright, which is nothing more than a government-created artificial monopoly to prevent competitive markets. That's the purpose of copyright. It's in the Constitution for exactly that reason. It assumes the form of postal subsidies. It assumes the form of all sorts of government advertising on commercial media. And I'm not necessarily opposed to subsidies. I think they're unavoidable. I think if you wanted to have a free market media system, it would require more government regulation to create a free market system than you have with our current system. I think it's impossible to avoid subsidies. I think the crisis we face in this country is that the policies that produce the subsidies are made secretively, corruptly, behind closed doors by extraordinarily powerful, well-held special interests who basically own the politicians. That's been the great crisis that we've tried to face in this movement and tried to come to terms with. And understand the nature of what it could be and how severe the crisis is, one need only look at American history. And one of the pleasures I've had doing this book and the book I wrote before this, The Problem of the Media, has been to go back and look at the early republic. So I wanted to figure out, what did the founders think about freedom of the press? What was going through their minds when this was put in the Constitution and policies were passed in the early republic? And what I discovered, somewhat to my surprise, but not entirely, was that if you look at the early republic, you will never see anyone saying, well, we ought to just let rich people run the press system, see who can make the most money, and hope we get lucky and they do something good. No one thought, we're just going to roll the dice and try to get lucky. It was understood that having a viable press system was the indispensable starting point for having a free society. I mean, the whole Constitution is premised on having a viable press system so people have the information to govern their own lives. And so it was understood at the get-go that the first job of the state was to create a viable free press, the first job of the state. And as a result of that, we instituted enormous postal subsidies to make it as easy as possible for magazines and newspapers to get started and get distributed. We instituted massive printing subsidies, which spawned dozens of newspapers that would not have existed without these government subsidies. The subsidies came in the form of like legal notices today, government notices being run in the paper, and the money coming from those supported the newspaper being able to exist. In fact, one of the policies that Jefferson and Madison as Secretaries of State put into place was that there be 3 newspapers so supported in every state of different political persuasion. This is the vision they had of how you could use policies to spawn a vibrant free press. And what's interesting as an aside, but it's an aside worth noting, is what exactly were the issues they were serving? Everyone knows abstractly you need viable information to have self-government. But what exactly drove Madison Jefferson? What was the obsession? And here it gets very interesting, because you look at Jefferson's most famous essay on freedom of the press, which he wrote in 1787, and he's trying to explain to someone why freedom of the press is so important.